Welcome to Going Deeper into Dev Marketing by Developer Market Pair, a show where we go beyond surface level, advise, and focus on actionable insights that dev tool founders and marketers can use to grow today. We'll do long interviews with top dev tool marketers, solo deep dives with yours truly, sprinkled with real life examples and teardowns. This will be fun. Oh, and yes, this was AI generated, but the rest of the show is very personal. Now, on to the show.
This week, I'm talking with Adam Frankl. Adam was a first marketing hire at 3 different dev tool startups that became unicorns. So that's Neo4j, JFrog, and Sourcegraph. He wrote a fantastic book, developer-facing startup, and then created a course, sort of like a cohort course where he helps founders, set up their marketing and figure out how to market as at a very early stage. So it's a fantastic playbook for dev tools. I'm a huge fan of Adam's. I think I watched or listened to every podcast I found, read the book, obviously, read all the notes that he had on TypeShare before it became the book. I think there are not many folks who have done it twice in DevTools, and he has done it not twice, but 3 times. And I think there is so much to learn from Adam. It is fantastic. On many things we agreed on some things we didn't. I tried to steer the conversation to get as many learnings for me as I possibly could have. I definitely learned a lot, had a lot of fun talking to Adam, and I hope you'll enjoy it.
Right. And so the teaching is what led me to blogging, right? And what blogging led me to writing the book. The book started as a COVID project. Mm-hmm. And then the book and teaching led me to offer a course, right? And so in the course, it's cohort based. So people learn at the same time, they learn from each other, right? But another key aspect for the course is that it's assignment based, right? I'm not just reading the book to you. You can read the book on your own, right? I actually expect people to complete assignments and post mm-hmm. their assignments for everyone else to see. Mm-hmm. And when people look at the work that other people have done, right, then they get ideas. And they also get a feeling for what the bar is. Because for too many people, the reason they don't do what they know they should do is they're perfectionists and they think they can't do it well enough. Okay. Mm-hmm. And that's terrible. Perfection is never one the goal.
I think the part of actually for this particular group of, typically ex-engineer, founder, CEOs, those folks are competitive as well, oftentimes. And so I think that's an additional aspect where you want to do well in a thing like that.
But they're competitive. But don't think of competitors as enemies, because that's not really the case, right? They're competitive in that they have rivals. And that's a very important distinction. A rival is not an enemy. A rival is a friend whose better performance pushes you to perform better. Mm-hmm. Right? It's a great thing to have rivals.
I saw someone say instead of saying rivals, they would use something like sparring partners, that having sparring partners, it's often so much better than having coaches, because a coach or like a teacher, they're detached, more abstract, it's harder to empathize.
It's even better to have both. It's even, right, because you can spar, you can argue with people, and then you've got someone else who can point out things that you're both missing, right, or some subtlety, or just some technique that you're just doing wrong. It's correct this, and you'll find everything else works a lot better. That's really the exciting thing of being a coach.
Yeah, like that.
For me, the important thing is to get the course right. Okay, so I have a plan. I'm executing my plan for the first cohort. I'm listening to all of the students as they go through it. And, we'll assess whether it was successful or not at the end. And then I'll go back, make adjustments to the course. And over time, it'll get better and better, right? that's the only way I know to do things, is to, I tell people, you can't, if you're afraid your product isn't perfect and you haven't launched it, you're doing it wrong, right? Yeah. You should be embarrassed the first time you launch your product. And there are things about the course that I'm embarrassed about. I want to get it out there. I want to get feedback from people, right? And then I'll work to fix it and refine it and expand it. Getting the course right is the most important thing.
Yeah, I think that's at the core of many things that you say, that you share, right? Like that iteration and iterating on feedback. Yeah. I think that I think it was the founder of Vercel who shared that they, instead of thinking about doing stuff right, like really right the first time, right? It's better to ship them faster and iterate. Like the iteration velocity is way more important than the step of that iteration, or like the step of improvement. And I think that's at the core of that concept. I really want to talk about the tab, right? Like that. But we'll get to that. You want to say something?
We'll get to that. I just want to talk about this, is that especially in the open source world, right? People make the mistake of thinking that their code is their most important intellectual property, IP. It's not. Okay. Especially at the early stage, because every line of code that you write right now, you're going to replace. Okay. The intellectual property that gives you a competitive advantage is the feedback that you get from your early users and customers, right? The fact that you wrote a product that does something, right? That is just what that's what gives you the right to collect feedback. The fact that you have feedback is what actually gives you market value, right? Because anyone can go out there and fork your code. What they don't understand is, how are the users using it, right? What direction does it need to go, right? That's the hardest IP to find, right? And
the machine,
that's in your head and in your plans.
The machine of turning feedback into, features that will actually be adopted and capabilities that actually matter. I think it's now there's a lot of discussion in my sort of world in ML AI, right? Where, sort of like, where does OpenAI or Anthropic, where is their IP in the model? And actually somebody said that no, like that their IP is in the machine that generates the models, in the like the combination of infrastructure and people and stuff like that. And I think it's sort of
so
similar,
many
isn't
things.
It?
Yeah. First of all, it's hard to make any prediction, especially about the future, right? And there are a couple different ways.
One of my favorite quotes. I used to be a data scientist. I loved that. I used to love that quote. I would repeat it a lot.
Yeah. So everyone wonders where the IP is, in AI, and this is something that's not original to me. I wish it was. Someone looked back and said, the last 20 years of B2B SaaS companies is basically, it's a thin layer wrapped around Postgres, right? You think about that from a pure technology point of view, that's correct, right? But there's the thin layer, like Salesforce.com, right? Is the IP the fact that Salesforce.com knows how sales organizations work, or the fact that they've got a great relational database behind it? The relational database is essential, right? You couldn't create an application without one, right? But the value of Salesforce is not the fact that they have a relational database underneath. It's the fact that they know how sales organizations work. Okay.
Yeah.
And my vision of the future, I think that the AI world will split, and there'll be some AI cores, like there's Postgres behind Salesforce, right? But then the AIs that you can train with a combination of public and proprietary data that are experts, right, in a specific task, will contain a tremendous amount of the IP.
Yeah,
not the fact that you've got some LLM
I think
running.
That's what you mentioned. Like, and even the fact that you can have opinionated solutions that are in different ways opinionated and that cater to different audiences, even within, like, why would you have so many different flavors of databases or or warehouses? Why? Like, it's the same thing, right? Like, it's the same problem.
That's a great question. Right? Oh my God. And there are 400 different databases available right now. Right. DB Engines is a great website, and it tracks every database I've ever heard of, and quite a few I haven't, and ranks them by popularity, and 400 databases. But Stonebreaker pointed out that every application there is, you can optimize a database for that application.
Exactly.
All right. And I think, drawing the metaphor over to AI is that, every application you can think of, you can optimize an AI for that. Now, what's the interface going to be in the future? Are people going to interact with, many different AIs throughout their day? Or is there going to be one AI that is your interaction specialist and then it interacts with all the other AIs? I don't know. The future's exciting.
I think the same rules that like the same rules apply, as in, you said that values in getting that feedback and transferring it, and having an excuse to gather that feedback. I think similarly here, like being, trying to do those optimizations, trying to use it in different ways, like it lets you learn from, what sort of things actually work, what don't work, what can you do, what cannot you do. It's like, if you think about it, it could be sort of like the first iterations in the web where people would just like put the grocery store on the web, and it was just like, an address and a phone number, and that's it, and that's the basically, like the first innovation of the internet, like compared to today.
I remember. Oh my God. It's 1993 was the first time I saw a web browser. Right. And we were so excited at the time. I was a junior marketing person. It's like we could just put our brochure on the web and we could save all of the printing costs. It's like that was the first really exciting thing, because printing costs and mailing costs in the early 90s were expensive. You'd get a lead, and then you'd got to think, well, do I just send them, the letter-sized envelope, or do I spend $1 on postage and send them in the fancy brochure? How good do I think this lead is? I mean, it just blows people's minds what was going on. That's only 30 years ago.
Yeah, no, but like if you sort of think about it through that lens, and we're talking about those different use cases for AIs, and how should they interact? Like I like to put some think about it in a way where, well, we're so far from knowing that interface of interacting can be so different. That doesn't mean that the interfaces that were there back then do not exist. Like if you think about it, like you have people do interact through terminal today, like, and this is the great method of interacting with certain products, right? Like in certain environments. So I think it's like, like it's not gonna replace it, but it's gonna replace it for some use cases, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, talking about terminals, one of my clients is Wave Terminal, and they're doing an AI-based terminal, right? It's like all those cryptic commands, it's like you don't need to remember them. You don't need to know them. There's like the AI knows them. You just tell the AI what you want, to have happened, and it will make it happen.
Even there, you have that, for some personas, it will be sort of terminal experience on steroids versus doing some sort of like me talking to my phone and doing that command. Like that's unlikely to solve some of those use cases. So I think but that's a very interesting discussion, and sort of like open-ended as it gets, but to figure out what that final interface is going to be like, you need to iterate on customer feedback, right? And understand what people want, what people want to do. And that was my sort of, sneaky way of segueing into the topic of the conversation, or like the thing that I really, really want to, ask you some questions about. But before we do that, let's introduce you. I absolutely would love, everyone to know about you, about your content. I'm a big fan. I read the articles that you put out there. I think it was on TypeShare, that later, some of them, I think, got extended and converted into the developer facing startup book that is fantastic. I recommend it to everyone. But Adam, could you say a few words, to...
Okay, I'll give you my 60-second autobiography and explain why I'm doing what I'm doing. So I started my career as a software developer. I have an engineering degree. My first professional job was working as a software engineer at Lockheed Skunk Works, where I worked on software for the F-22. Great airplane. If you get a chance to fly it, I recommend it very highly. And while I was there, we had a presentation from the CEO of a dev tools startup. And afterwards, I remember telling him, we love the tools. We're going to buy them, but you don't really know how to talk to developers. And that strange comment turned into a job offer, which I then surprised myself by taking. And I became that startup's first product manager, right? That was about 30 years ago. And since then, I have been a co-founder or first VP of marketing at a dozen different venture-backed startups, all developer-facing, right? And it's been a crazy journey. And I originally started doing it because I felt that the marketing towards developers was so bad, right, that I could come in and make a big improvement. And I could, but it just stayed so bad. And then I began figuring out over time, over years, why it was so bad. Now, part of it, it was my fault. So when I first became a marketer targeting developers, which is a kind of a weird niche in its own, right, I felt I knew what I needed to do. I worked closely with our engineering team, and I just was really clear about how the product worked. Okay. And I tried to be as clear as possible. And I did this for years, and it didn't work. And it kept on not working, even as hard as I tried. Right. But I was convinced this was the way. Right. Then a seminal event in my career was the HBO series Mad Men. And I remember when it came out, it was like thunderstruck. It's like marketing is about being clever. Finally, this is what I've been waiting for. And so I switched from being very, hard-nosed engineer to being very clever. And I could be clever in a conference room with the best of them, right? Clever taglines, clever campaigns, clever websites, clever descriptions, right? It was a lot of fun, but it didn't work. I did it for years, even though it was obvious that it wasn't working. Okay. Then the big change in my life was Steve Blank, was his book, 4 Steps to the Epiphany, which I look back on, it's almost unreadable, but what a seminal book. And then I took his course. And Steve Blank's big insight is get out of the building and talk to customers. And I said, I haven't really been doing much of this. Maybe it could work, right? So my next startup, I said, I'm going to lead with this approach. And to my shock, it worked. And that startup became a unicorn, right? And I said, wow, what a crazy idea. What a, mad coincidence. I'm going to try this again. So the next startup I joined, right, I did the same thing, focus on talking to users and talking to developers. $5 billion IPO, right? And by the time it's like, I figured this thing out, but I couldn't let it go. It's like 2 of them still might be a coincidence. So I went and did a third, talk to users, unicorn. And it's like, okay, now I've got this nailed, right? I've got a repeatable, scalable model. But also at the time, it's like, I'm getting kind of old to actually, continue to be an operator. So that's when I decided to, first I decided to be a consultant. And I said, okay, all I'm going to do is run technical advisory boards for hire. And I did it for a couple of years. It was a lot of fun. And I would prepare this huge report that would land on CEO's desk with a huge thud, right? And they could read it or they could not read it, right? They're busy people. But I finally felt that this... No, usually they got this document and it's like they already had decided what they wanted to do. And so whatever I came up with, they used it to justify the decision that they had made already. And I was making a lot of money, but it wasn't very satisfying. It's like, you shouldn't outsource this work because fundamentally, this is what founders do, right? So instead I shifted from being a consultant to being an advisor. And I began teaching founders what they need to do to be effective founders. Right. And that took off. And I've coached hundreds of companies now. And, what the techniques I've learned, I wrote them up. I've posted a lot on LinkedIn. And then I decided during my COVID project was to assemble everything into a book. Right. So that's how long it took to actually get the book out. Right. Almost those 4
books,
years.
Those books, they take a bit.
They take a long time. And I had a lot of ideas. I started a Google Doc called Adam's 10 rules for developer marketing. And that soon became
were they
50
mutable
rules.
or unmutable,
They were very mutable. Let me tell you how I muted them, which is I wrote up a description for every single one of those rules, and then I would post it on LinkedIn, and I'd get feedback on LinkedIn. And if I got great engagement, I kept it, and it went into the book. And if people said, "Nah, this is not interesting," I threw it away. Right.
So that's dog fooding, basically the ideas that you share in the book as well.
Exactly.
I like that.
And if the feedback came back, we have questions, we want more, then I would write more about that. Right. So I started off with twice as much content as is in the book. I threw away 2/3 of it. Okay. And then I came back and said, all right, what do people demand more of? And that's what that's what finally came out in the book. And the book is great.
I do think that. And what I liked about it was that it did seem to be actionable, like the focus of it being actionable and being short. So definitely being clear. I think there is there's this, like, you can prove expertise by going longer. I mean, at least that's how many folks want to prove their expertise. I can go deeper, I can go longer, I can go but I think actually dropping stuff via negativa, I guess that sort of approach is way more powerful. Like, what's the actual core, not everything you know about it, what's the actual core of that.
That's a big part of the book, right? So Rob Fitzgerald, he wrote The Mom Test, and he offers an online course for nonfiction authors. And I took his online course. That was one of the inspirations for me doing an online course. And I learned so much from him about what makes a great nonfiction book, right? Especially a great business book, because this is a business book, right? So many things. One of the things that he writes about is have a specific audience person or persona that you're writing for. And that was a big problem that I didn't even realize I had. Because when I first started writing, I had a variety of audiences. I was writing for developer marketers, an audience that you know really well. I was writing for VPs of marketing at developer-facing companies. And I was writing for founders, right? And each of these are different, okay? Especially the founders who often have no background in marketing or sales. They're engineers, right? And they have a vision of a product, and that's why they have to start a company. And they've got the hardest job because as an early stage founder, you don't have marketers or salespeople around you. You're expected to come up with the go-to-market on your own. And like, where do you start? There's nothing there. So I decided I was going to narrow my persona to this person, right? Because they were a specific person going through a transition. They just started a company and they had a need. I need to go to market with my product. Okay. And that gave me a lot of focus for the book. Because all the stuff for VPs of marketing just went out, and all the stuff for developer marketers just went out. Okay, maybe there'll be other books someday, but probably not.
Hopefully,
right? And so that enabled me to focus. And then what Fitzgerald also said, he said most business books are read on airplanes. Okay, and the percentage of people that will pick up a book that they went halfway through on the first flight is about zero. Okay, so you got to keep your book short enough to be read completely on one flight. Okay, so that provided me with an upper limit, right? And the third thing I learned was he says you've got to get, books are not sold by authors. They're sold by readers. Readers make recommendations. And what's very interesting is if you think about books you've recommended, often they're not your favorite books, but they're books for a specific persona at a specific transition that has recommended actions that you took. And so I said, okay, that's what I'm going for. And also he said,
I think the same goes for, for other stuff as well. Like, you mentioned being that, doing tab, technical advisory board that we're going to talk about, sort of as a service, right?
Yeah.
And then, if you do something so narrow, you get, basically every time that thing comes up, you're going to be picked for that. Like on the pod in a different episode, I was talking to Itamar Benier, who only does LinkedIn ads, but not only that, I mean, maybe not only, but like this is what his entire focus, developer focused LinkedIn ads with a creative style of TikTok videos. That's his focus, because he found that, that being really good, working with early stage founders, etc. But like, I think if you you kind of want to occupy that spot in somebody's brain. Like, what's your spot? What's your spot? And so I think like that the same goes for books, for articles, for consultants, right? And for companies, hopefully, if you have a product, you want to have that spot,
Exactly. Pick a spot that hopefully there's no one else in that spot, right? And then you fill up that category, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm a huge fan of Christopher Lochhead and his idea of category design, right? And so can I design my own category, right, of developer-facing startups, right? Because that word, some people used it, but it wasn't really defined before my book. But once you tell people about it, it's like people know immediately if they're in that category or not in that category.
As
right?
What do you mean? Like with
are you a developer? Are you a founder of a developer-facing startup or not?
That's
right?
part of it,
If
right?
I
like
am,
you want to be sort of be able to self-qualify, self-disqualify, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah,
exactly. All right. I know you want to talk about the tab, and I know you want to talk about it because everyone wants to talk about it.
But I actually have an angle that I want to explore, and an angle is something that you perhaps didn't talk as much in the book, because as you mentioned, it's focused on founders, right? So I think there are tweaks or that I want to discuss when it comes to doing the tab as a founder, right? A founder CEO, right? Versus doing it as a head of marketing or a single marketer at the DevTool startup, et cetera, et cetera. And many folks who I talk to, who read my stuff, those folks are developer marketers. I'm a developer marketer as well. And I think a ton of the stuff is one-to-one transferable. But some of the things I wonder, how are they transferable? And I kind of want to dig into the examples, dig into some questions.
Ask me anything, because I've been a developer marketer for decades.
Awesome. Yeah. So let's start maybe with like a super quick, introduction of the tab. By the way, for deeper stuff, you can always go to, read Adam's book, or listen to Adam talking about it on Scaling DevTools. There's a fantastic conversation with Jack Bridger that goes into many different things. Fantastic, stuff. But so let's just start with defining the tab, and then we go into tacticals, how we go about creating one for the marketing department, or for if you're a marketer. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the tab, right? What does the tab stand for? TAB. It's a technical advisory board. Okay, and that sounds really serious, but something you have to realize is that it's not technical. It does not give advice, and it is not a board. That's just what it's called. Okay, because don't be frightened off by it. And what the tab is, it's a systematic way of collecting feedback from developers about the problem that you're solving, right? Which is so essential. And whether you're founding a startup or whether you're, part of a larger organization aiming at developers, right? You need to get this feedback. And the first challenge most people have, right, is how do I recruit people to be on my tab?
Exactly.
And who should be members of my tab? Because people often have a mistaken idea that this should be the smartest people that they know, right? That this is my dissertation advisor, or this is the CTO at my last company who I really respect, right? Or other really smart people. This should be your tab. Those people are great, right? They can give you lots of advice, but those are not tab members, right? So when you start off, I encourage all of my clients to hypothesize around all of the personas that are going to be part of bringing their technology into organization. Okay, developers, developer managers, CTOs, sometimes SREs, data scientists, right? All of these different people, CISO, right? Then often founders will come up with about a dozen different personas. Then you need to have multiple representatives of each of these personas on your tab. Okay, it's not just one type of person, it's a variety of people. Okay, then you need to reach out and recruit people. And people, it sounds like a daunting task. It's like, I want to, I know my friends, I know my contacts, I can reach out to them. And that's great. That's a great place to start. Okay. But you also need to reach out to people you don't know.
But I actually think like that's the first place where it may diverge between the founder and non-founding executive or head of marketing, as reaching out. I know how even today, I'm both a co-founder and I run marketing for a startup, right? So in most of the places, it's better if I say I'm the founder, or a co-founder.
Oh yeah.
If I want to talk to someone, then be explicit and say, hey, I'm running marketing, at so and so startup, right? So I wonder, how do you tweak it, for folks who are not founders, for folks who are, marketers? They want to figure out, understand better the personas they should be going after, they should be talking to, they should be catering when it comes to the content and strategy. How do you tweak that to the marketing persona?
That's a great question, because you absolutely need to do it. And so you're going to change your offer. So when you're a founder and you reach out to someone you don't know, right? And you say, I've read what you wrote about this. I have founded a startup to attack this problem. I would appreciate it if you would consider joining my technical advisory board. People love founders. They love startups. Right? They don't like buying things from startups, but they love giving advice, right? So those things work together to say, all right, I'll consider joining your technical advisory board, right? But if you're a marketer, I've been in this position, you're absolutely stuck. It's like, are you going to do outreach, outside of your established channels, right? And you're not a salesperson, what exactly are you doing? So you need to come up with a plan that enables you, because you absolutely need to do this, right? Then puts you in contact with actual users, but you also need to run it by your executive team and your CEO to get them bought into the process, right? Because basically, this is a strategy. This is not a tactic, right? Your CEO has to be bought into the strategy that to be an effective marketer, you have to deeply understand your users and your prospects. And the only way to deeply understand them is to talk to them. So you need to come up with a mechanism for reaching out to them, independent of your sales lead generation mechanism.
So just to understand, Adam, because you're saying, we need, founders bought in. Oftentimes what I see is founders are bought into the idea, and there could be budget allocated to it, but it's not a time budget. It's a money budget. It's not a time of the founder or of head of product, budget. It's money, so you can exchange that for interviews.
Yeah. It's like someone has to do the work. Okay. And, you can, there are basically three models, right? There's either the founder does it, right? Or a non-founder employee does it, right? Or you hire an outside consultant to do it. And I've been that outside consultant. I actually wouldn't recommend that. Okay, because the gist of the knowledge that the outside consultant learns is not going to be transferred inside the organization, right? Consultants work by project. When the project's over, they're on to the next project, right? For usually for a different firm, right? You want the knowledge you gain from talking to all these people is so valuable. You want to retain that inside the company. If the founders, because not all founders are capable of doing this, I recognize this, right? Especially in our industry. Sometimes founders are just, the social skills are not something that they focused on, right? They focused on ideas and coding. Okay. You can bring in someone to lead this effort. What I recommend is that, you don't call this some person, a marketer or a salesperson. The title I love is chief scientist. Okay. Because as a chief scientist.
So were you a chief scientist that some of those unicorns? Was that your title?
That was not my title, but we had people who had those titles there. Okay.
I see.
And a chief scientist is someone technical, but the vast majority of their job is dealing with customers and prospects. Okay. So it's kind of like, it's a peer level to the CTO, except the CTO is different.
So would that be sort of like a solution architect type persona, or like a principal, so like a senior principal solution architect, just renamed and refocused to a slightly different?
Yes. the solution architect could work as a chief scientist, right? The difference is the solution architect, it's in the title. They're focused on the solution, okay? A chief scientist is focused on the problem, right? Imagine, you should come up, if you were going to write a book, which I recommend, right? Then you want to put the problem in the title of the book, because that's what will get people to read it, not your solution. Okay. And just throw out an example of this. I was the first VP of marketing at Neo4j, and we did a book with O'Reilly, and O'Reilly came to us. They wanted to call the book the Neo4j Bible, right? And I said, no, that's not what we're going to do it. We're going to call the book Graph Databases, right? Because that, Neo4j Bible is about a specific solution. Graph databases is more oriented towards the problem and how this type of solution might work for the type of problem. I think if I had my way, I would have called it, querying connected data, but that wasn't going to fly. So we called it graph databases.
Also, I think okay. to that point, I think if you start by owning the problem or the keyword for the problem, or like in technical terms, or just when you start with the problem and then you shape the solution, right? Like bigger part of the market understands the problem. You're sort of creating the future in which you win. I think that's
You're exactly correct. Frame the problem is the first chance, because what I've also learned is that if you are an expert in the problem, everyone will assume you have a solution to it. You don't need to tell them you have a solution to it. Okay. And quite frankly, most people are pretty bored by your solution. They want to talk about the problem.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean,
because
first I want to
unique.
understand, especially in DevTools, I think like first I like by default, I will assume you don't understand my problem. And when I hear you say the problem, I'm going to have an obvious solution in my head. And ideally, you meet me there and you say why obvious solution doesn't work, and and then you start you start getting my attention and my trust, because like at least you thought about the sort of like the obvious thing that I would have done if that was my project over the weekend or whatever that was. But I think this is sort of you could take some of the classic marketing frameworks and convert them to dev if you really pin that problem and you really agitate that problem. And the mechanism there is for you build the trust by explaining that you understand my problem, because by design I will assume you don't understand my problem, and I'll be right.
Yeah. So okay, also there are a couple different ways of becoming an expert. Okay. One of which is you go grab 100 books and you lock yourself in a dusty library, and maybe you get your PhD, right? And you spend all this time studying and you make yourself into an expert. That's fine. Lots of people do that, right? There's another way to become an expert, and that's go talk to 100 people who are experiencing the problem right now. Okay. And you will become an expert by understanding what they're telling you. So if there were two people who you have got a problem, and and there were two people to talk to, and one of whom said, I have locked myself in the library for 2 years and I understand everything about this problem. And the other person said, I've talked to 100 people like you who have this problem, and here's what they're doing about it. Which one are you going to talk to? Right? In our industry, right, there are occasionally brilliant people that become experts by locking themselves in libraries. But for the vast majority of people, you want people who are out there interacting with the industry. If you're a dev and you encounter a problem, right, your first thought isn't, I am the first person to ever have this problem. No, it's like lots of other people have had this problem before me. Okay. How have they solved it? I need to find out. That's why devs have two screens, right? How many screens do you have when you're writing code?
I actually have one. I'm a crazy person. I have one.
Crazy.
But the reason for it is I like to be mobile, and I found that I do like having multiple screens. But then I only want to work at home, and I like to travel, and I like to work in weird Airbnbs and stuff. And I figure I'm going to take a hit on that, but it's
So
vast majority
apart
of
from digital nomads, devs have two screens, and one of them is the code screen, and the other is what I call the answer screen. Right. And on the answer screen, you are trying to figure out how other people have solved the problem you have right now. Right. And you're either asking ChatGPT. If you're old school, you're Googling. If you're really old school, you're on Stack Overflow. Right. But you're figuring out how have other people solved this problem, because being a developer is the most social occupation there is, and this comes as a shock.
Adam, before we get into that part, which I love, by the way, I think it's like very like it's counterintuitive and so true. But I think that, you know, coming back to the recruitment of you know, how do you recruit tab members as a marketer, right? And you mentioned that, well, you either go through the founder, you can have that chief scientist. So all hope is gone. You know, me as a marketer, I cannot really do it myself.
There are other ways to do it, right? My favorite way of recruiting tab members is via social media. Okay, which is publish, right? As a make sure that the CEO is behind this plan, right? Do this in public. Okay, get your name out there, right? Publish on LinkedIn, right? Putting a blog on your own website, that's not where people are. They're not coming to your website. So put your blog out there where people are going to find it. Okay, and get ideas out there, because when you publish, you will get engagement. And everyone who engages with you are, by definition, interested in your ideas. Reach out to them and invite them to be part of your tab.
But
right?
Everyone makes a comment where I challenge that, because I wonder, because you know, for people to engage with your content, right, you need to have a certain level of depth, or at least devs need to understand that there's depth into this. There is thinking. There is understanding of my problem. And as a marketer, you know, starting to build that empathy and understanding of the problem, I find I don't know anyone who publishes as a marketer who can publish anything, you know, valuable to a dev, you know, on their first day, or often, you know, almost ever. I remember there was this interesting discussion on one of the podcasts. I think there was you know, the first marketer at Figma, and she said that basically they had this rule where if she understood what their designers wrote, the blog post, if she understood it, it meant it was bad. It meant it was too simple, you know. So she, like, that was the rule, like that was the bar, you know. Like if she could understand it, it means that it's not good. It's likely not good for. So I'm wondering, because there's this gap, right? And it's difficult to bridge that gap. You create writing programs, you get dev roles on the team, etc. I'm sort of thinking, it's like, you know, publishing as a marketer, right? Where I don't have that expertise. I know stuff around marketing, around, you know, how to write, how to, you know, lots of stuff, but I don't have the empathy. I don't understand the problem that well, that deeply.
Here's how to solve this problem. And this is a real problem. Okay. Number one, you know, don't try and pretend you're a dev if you're not a dev. Okay. The second thing is, what you need to imagine is that you're a journalist. That's the approach, right? The journalists aren't experts in every field, right? They're experts in how to do journalism. So your job, right, as this marketer / journalist, is to go out and interview people, right? Be able to summarize the ideas that you're getting and publish them in an easy to consume format. So you don't necessarily have to have an opinion to start, although I think that would be great if you did, right? If you set out, like look at what Jack did, right? He decided, I want to learn more about scaling dev tools, right? Therefore, I'm going to talk to 100 people, right? Was he an expert in that topic when he started? Absolutely not. That's why he wanted to go do it, right? Is he an expert now? Absolutely, right? Did he pretend to be an expert on his podcast? No. He asked good questions, right? That's the key. Take the approach that here is a fascinating problem area. You're going to be writing about this problem area. You are not the expert. You're going to figure out who the experts are, and you're going to interview them over and over again, right? You're going to interview them individually, right? And write about what they have to say. You're going to compare their answers and be an analyst, and you're going to provide perspective on here is what the industry consensus is. Here are some of the other views, right?
That.
Be interesting to your audience and approach it the way a great journalist does.
I like that. Actually, like when you started talking about it, I realized there is a good example of that. I don't remember exactly the name of the company, but I listened to a podcast that's a common theme. I love listening to podcasts, but there was a head of marketing, you know, from one of the security companies, and they basically approach it this way. They figured, hey, how about we build Bloomberg News, but for security? We're going to hire, reporters across the world and create Bloomberg News for security. We're not experts in it. We cannot do it ourselves, but we know how to get to experts. We can operationalize it. We can create it this way. So you get those stories out. You get folks, you talk to folks and make it interesting. So I like it. So let's say that happens. So I'm Jack, or Jack equivalent for my startup. I start sharing those comparisons, start sharing the insights I learned, and build my profile and the level of discussions through that. Right. What do I do then? How do I
you reach out? That's one of the brilliant things about social media, and underappreciated by people who don't comment on it, right? Is the fact that you get feedback, right? You get signal about, how many people are reading or watching your posts, and you can get signal for, individuals, right? If they like, engage, if they repost, if they comment, okay? And, if you don't get any engagement for your first 30 days, then you're doing okay, because every person's first 30 posts are just terrible. Okay. The only way to get good at social media is to do social media. And so you need to start today, because your first 30 posts will be terrible. And then you'll get good at it, and you'll get signal, and you'll understand how to read the signal and how to respond to it. Right. There's so many great things about social media. One of which is no one ever goes back and looks at your early posts. That's not a thing. Okay. If you want to, most sites you can delete them.
Sometimes like you have me, like I remember going through, I think it was like 6 months of super-based Twitter feed. So I may be one of those people, doing that kind of stuff, some from time to time, but it's that's different. I agree with you.
It's rare. And also, I mean, here's the thing: many people they're afraid to post, right? And the posting on social media and executing a tab absolutely go hand in hand, because you'll recruit your followers to become the tab. Every time you have a tab interview, you will get an idea, sometimes 20 ideas. Write about one of them, right? So the tab is a never-ending source of ideas to write about. Every time you write, you'll find new people to recruit from. Okay,
I think to that, like there are ways of operationalizing it, and I know folks build entire content programs around it where, I mean, you can do it starting from keywords and figuring what keywords are important, blah blah blah. But actually, then you realize that those oftentimes
let me tell you, I so hate that.
Right? Yeah, it's. I think there's like merits to doing that to create authority. Then you connect it to what actually converts, and there's like, But yeah, like I think you talk to a customer or a prospect or somebody who's like your audience, as you mentioned, on socials or elsewhere, and they mention, or in the tab interview, they say that they were looking for how to do XYZ, or they wanted to, and they use specific words. You put those words into a tool, and you see that it's not many people searching. But doesn't matter. Even if it's not many people search, those people will be converting, right? Like I think that's the part where, like you can.
Okay, I've got a point of view that's different on this, which is I hate I hate search engine optimization. I hate keywords, right? I hate the whole optimizing for a conversion pipeline. And I think it's a false, it's a mirage that you're aiming for, okay?
But you did mention the idea, like you get the ideas, right? From the tab
get the ideas,
you get the ideas.
Yeah.
For what? What do you do with them later?
Oh, we'll talk about how what you do with a tab. But first, I'm going to go on a diatribe against content marketing. Not all of content marketing, but vast majority of content marketing is worse than nothing. Okay.
I agree. I agree.
With the content marketing, right, really comes from the fact that it's so easy to fool Google. What developers want is they want thought leadership that explains to them how to solve the problems they have right now.
Okay, so let me finish this idea, Jacob. But let's. So I like the idea. Let's go into that. But maybe just to understand for the listeners, when you say content marketing, what do you mean? Because I think maybe actually we have a different definition of what those things are.
Okay, great. So I was working with a startup, right? One of my clients, and they were doing software to assist in doing code reviews. It's a great problem area because code reviews are absolutely fantastic at improving the quality of code, yet few organizations do them as well or as often as they should. Okay, great area to improve on.
Yep.
And the founder was telling me that their plan was to hire a tech writer, and the tech writer had contracted for them to produce 75 blog posts about code reviews. Okay. And that was it just struck me that's like the worst idea ever. Okay. Because they weren't actually going and doing research, right? They weren't figuring out what worked and what doesn't. They just hired a tech writer who all that the tech writer was going to do was, use Google, find out what other people had been written, and then rewrite those ideas and just put them out over and over and over again. In other words, what they were really trying to do was fool Google into thinking this was thought leadership content, because Google can't tell. If you use the right keywords, right, and have the right link strategy, everything comes up and it looks just like a thought leadership paper, right? There's the famous I'm trying to remember this idea. There was this pseudo-scientific article that got placed in social text, right? That the author later realized, it was just gibberish, but it was designed to look like a scientific article, and it got past all the peer reviews. It's like, I thought, what a fantastic prank. Okay. But we're doing that to ourselves over and over again by putting out, quote, content marketing that's just other people's ideas repackaged.
So what you're saying is basically the thing that you're against when it comes to developer go to market or how to reach developers is the SEO focused content machines.
Yes, that is absolutely correct. I can't stand that. In fact, most devs now, they won't fall for it. If you search with Google, you'll put in some keywords, a page will come back, and you don't even have to click through, because you can just look at this page of results and say, this is all crap.
Especially like now what's interesting is now you have Perplexity and other tools that basically, they extract the insights focusing on first, sort of like first-hand knowledge, first-hand experience, right? So even if your blog didn't rank before, now it's a first-hand experience that goes into that engine and usage of those things. So we're sort of like getting back, to a better spot.
We are getting back. But what I really recommend people do, right, and what I hope the AIs will leverage, right, is think back before there was Google, right? You actually had thought leaders who did research and wrote papers based on what they found out. Okay. Yeah. This may be way too old for some. That used to be how science worked.
If you go to Hacker News, I think it's like this is how that page feels like. Still,
people respect it. The other thing that's so important, right, is the fact that you have branded content. Okay, but not branded with your company, branded with an individual. In other words, that there's some individual out there who's basically staking their reputation on the accuracy of what they're writing. Okay, because it doesn't take long for devs to figure out this person knows what they're talking about. Okay, and I'm going to follow Kelsey Hightower, right? Or any of the other, you have O'Reilly books on your bookshelf. Those authors are people you trust, and they're who you're going to follow. And so essentially their content has become branded with the author's name. The author has become a trusted expert in your problem area. Okay. That's how you can tell actual thought leadership from content marketing crap. So your goal as a startup founder or even as a developer marketer is to become a thought leader in this space, either because you're making discoveries or maybe you're just reporting on discoveries. Okay. But give me something new.
Yes. And I think it's like now we see the reverse to, reversal, right? To what it was with like blog, in 1985, like Substacks and stuff like that. I think a lot of that, I don't want to go into that, but I would say that I think there is still a lot of value in owning, like, be it what you will, but owning, especially longer tail keywords, for particular jobs to be done and use cases and stuff like that. If you can do it through, like a source that people trust, you create that, like, there are some places that people trust, developers. Fly.io is a good example, their blog and content. But but I think it's like overall, it's very good to understand that those owning a high level term in SEO, that doesn't bring you the customers you want. It brings you a completely different crowd that you really don't want. So I think that I can definitely agree with you.
Right. Mm-hmm. So, become the name out there that people recognize, right? In your space. And then when you do that, you'll find it's much easier to reach out to people and ask them to join your tab if they've read stuff you've written and they recognize your name, right? Operating blind is the hardest thing you'll ever do.
Yeah. Maybe I have a question on that, sort of on that example you shared, and I love it, like that sort of playbook for even if you're a marketer who who's not a developer or hasn't been a developer, you can still build that, create that thought leadership, maybe not thought leadership, but just reporting on super interesting things that are happening. Any examples of, from your career of, of that happening and sort of like those folks, what does later happen, to those folks? Do they end up staying in that niche, or like, maybe you can share some examples of those stories.
So I'm going to give you a related example because no exact example comes to mind, right? But one of the things that we did at Neo4j early on was we published this graph blog and a graph newsletter. And a decision that we made early on was we weren't just going to publish news about Neo4j, right? We were really promoting we came up, Neo4j invented the idea of the graph database. It sounds like it should have been around for like forever, right?
So did you rank for it? Did you rank for graph database? Hopefully,
I don't even remember. That wasn't the goal. Okay, because the first thing was rank for it. No one had ever heard of the term when we started using it. There was no search for graph database.
You got to market it. Okay,
exactly. So the first project we did was to define what a graph database was, and then persuade everyone in the NoSQL movement that graph was part of NoSQL, because it wasn't originally, because we just made up the term, right? And it's like, no, if you're not Mongo and you're not a big table, then what are you? And that took about a year, honestly. And then graph was accepted as part of the NoSQL movement. But a key part of what we were doing was we put out this blog and newsletter that reported on everything going on in the graph business, including all of our competitors. And competitors started showing up, right? Other people had ideas about graphs. And what happened was, because we were reporting on everyone, our newsletter became the must-read.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Everyone who's interested in graph database says, oh yeah, you need to get on this list. Okay, you need to follow, Neo4j. Right, as opposed to just being, a product-centered newsletter or a company-centered newsletter. So that's one example of, we had a great chief scientist, right? But we also took a journalistic output towards we're going to cover everything going on in this category, because and in any nascent category, people who become enthusiastic about it, right? They want to know everything. And in every category, you're going to have enthusiasts.
And that's where you want to be, especially as a founder. Like founding a startup, ideally you find a market and a problem that's going to be growing, that's going to be big, and you become, the category defining, thing, right? That's where the big wins come, and that's sort of connects to what you said. I also think
is that own the whole category, not just your product.
Yeah, and you can do that only early. Or you define a separate category or a tweak on a category. Like I'm actually on the category front. Like I think, and that's something, maybe it's for a different discussion, but I think it's an interesting one where, you can carve out a piece of the market, right? By being a tweak on a category, right? Like you're that, but doing stuff different, and you can message that clear, etc. But it's only going to be a piece. And then the only company that can just say we're graph databases is the leader, and the leader is typically one of the first ones, or the first one that got big, right? And they can just say graph database, and they can get all the juice, and you can get all the differentiation for use case, etc., and get a piece of that market, but not a big win. It seems, I think that's.
I think you're correct. in that, especially at an early stage, here's such an important idea. Different is better than better.
Yeah.
Okay. In that you have to be different, because if you are merely better than someone else, right, that's ephemeral. They can get better, right? And who defines what's better? It's going to be different for every person. Better is just a terrible word that you should just eliminate from a marketer's vocabulary. What people care about is different, right? How different are you, right? Maybe the products are functionally identical, but your business model is different, right? That could be the critical difference, because that means there's a certain customer segment out there that has a value proposition that is perfect for. Yeah. And so when you're different, the best way to prove you're different is by designing your own category.
Oh, when you say, yeah, maybe I don't want to go too deep into this because I really want to get back to a few questions I have around the tab, but like I think there's going to be a follow-up coming at some point around categories, because I think like it's a super interesting, subject of whether, because like, yeah, like anchoring on the existing category sound like is super known. Do you really create a new category, or is it just a, tweak on it? So let's say, I don't know, you have like privacy centric something, right? Is it really a different category?
Let me throw an example, right? MySQL is a classic example, or Oracle owned the relational database market, right? And then MySQL came along, and Mikino said, I'm going to cut the relational database market in half and then take half of that. And he did, right? And is MySQL better than Oracle? That's certainly an interesting debate. I'm not going to get into here, but its business model is certainly different, right?
Yeah.
And
same with Postgres later, right? Same with Postgres being open source later. That's a business model completely different. Right?
Exactly. Could you debate the features of them? I'm sure database engineers would love to spend days, weeks, months debating the features. But quite frankly, the main difference is open source databases are a fundamentally different business model than Oracle. And so it's a different category. It's a whole different set of applications.
I like that. I think then yeah, like, yeah, but anyhow, I think that's a very interesting discussion. But now, coming back, coming back to that marketer who, build that tab, or maybe with the help of a founder or a chief scientist, they build a tab, and they are getting ready for, for that first call. What do you do in the first call? What do you do in the second call? How does that look like?
So exciting.
What are your favorite questions? Let's go into that.
Okay, I have favorite questions. So this is how I teach people to do this. And I'm a teacher, but I'm not a professor. I don't grade you. Everyone needs to customize it for their own situation. Good. One of the principles is you should ask the exact same questions every time you do a tab interview. And this took me years to figure out, because I used to approach tab interviews like they were conversations. And the problem with that is you do a lot of them and you end up with a tremendous amount of data and you've got no way to analyze it for insight. So I like to have a prepared question list that I'm going to ask. And I keep the calls.
Do you ask all of them? Do you ask all of those questions in there, or you ask the same questions but sometimes skip, when things are not maybe going in the direction?
So you have some. I try and ask the same questions, but interviews sometimes go off, right? But I also try and keep the interviews to 30 minutes, right? Because if someone has an idea, you'll learn it in the first 30 minutes, right? That gives you time for about 5 questions. That's it. Okay. And my absolute favorite question, it's not original to me. It's out of Lean Customer Development by Cindy Alvarez.
I love that book.
And the question is what I call the magic wand question. If you could wave a magic wand and change anything about the problem area, right, what would it be? Don't worry about if it's possible, just anything, right? And then you shut up. And then you let your tab member think, right, and give you a reply, right? I love this question because it frames their thinking in terms of the problem and their situation, what they would change. Okay. Then I have a follow-up to that question, which is, if we could deliver that, how would that change your life? And then you shut up. That question is also not original to me. That's actually from Andy Raskin, who is another brilliant guy in customer development. I don't know when his book will come out.
Strategy,
it'll be great.
Does the strategic narrative, right? Andy Raskin.
Yes, that's him. Okay, you should get him as a guest. He's absolutely brilliant. And then the combination of those two questions is fantastic, because the first question frames it as some change that I want to see. And then you want to really understand, why is it that they want that change? Because the answer to the second question is what you're actually selling. You're not selling a piece of software. You're selling a change to someone's life, and you want them to articulate that for you. Okay, so those are my two most favorite questions. My third most favorite question is actually also from Andy Raskin. I took Andy Raskin's course at General Assembly, which was absolutely illuminating. My third most favorite question is, what is different about the world now, such that what we just described is more valuable than it was 2 or 3 years ago? Because what you want people to do is you want people to articulate the changes that are going on in their environment, because you need to create urgency, especially at a startup, because your customers were succeeding without you yesterday, and yet you have to convince them that they're not going to succeed without you tomorrow. Okay.
Yeah. And I think that's a beautiful nuance to that. If you take it at face value and you read, and I read lots of stuff, folks talking, actually LinkedIn, a lot of it, Andy Raskin and others talking about strategic narrative and problems with it, etc., and used it internally. The tricky part there is that, and the beautiful framing that you have, I think, is that part of, it's not that you cannot do your job today, is that it's getting, it's getting worse and worse, or like it's going to get worse and worse over time. At a certain point, it's going to happen. So you don't frame it in a, if you don't do it, you're lost. If you don't do it today, you're lost. Because if you do that to devs, they're like, seriously, like what? What are you talking about? It's not plausible. Right. So I think this is a beautiful nuance there.
Right. So you need to identify a trend that the trend has to be absolutely undeniable. Okay. And the way you get to ask your developers, right?
Can you give examples, just for the examples from your previous companies?
Microservices is a massive trend, right? Complexity of data, right? I think the favorite trend, when I was at Sourcegraph, right, we identified the big trend impacting everyone was big code, right? Which is, just like big data.
Monolith, big monolith.
No. I'm not monolith versus that's separate. In other words, I compared big code to big data of 20 years ago, right? Massive increases in the order of magnitude of volume, velocity, variety, and value of source code have fundamentally changed the developer's environment, right? And in one sense, it's great. Everyone's using all these open source libraries. On the second sense, just the amount of code going into every app has increased by 10 or 100x. Okay. And that has all sorts of negative impacts on everything, including for Sourcegraph. It's like, how do you find the code that's causing me a problem, or the code I need to update? Right. So Sourcegraph was the answer. It was originally Sourcegraph started in code search before they went into AI code generation. And it was like, how do you why do you need code search now, whereas you didn't really have it before, right? Well, big code is causing you this problem. And you talk about big code, and people say, yeah, that's absolutely true. That's going on in our shop. Okay. And is it getting better or worse? No, it's getting worse every day. Right. So you want a problem that is making developers' life worse every day, and a problem that if they don't address it today, one day it will be catastrophic. And we'll just get to the point where I just can't find everything. My code base is just so completely indecipherable that we just can't find the code we need to update, let alone figure out how to update it. So big code was my favorite example of, this is a trend making your life worse every day.
So that was it's a great example. And we had three questions. Like the first question was the magic wand question. If you could do anything, don't worry about plausibility of this. What would that be? How would your life change? The third one is about identifying the trend. What was the big thing? What is the thing that is getting worse every, how did you phrase it?
Those are my okay. What are the major trends, right? So what we just discussed, right? what are the major trends making this more valuable than it was 2 or 3 years ago? And the 2 or 3 years is just give enough time frame to say, yeah, this is a major long-term trend, right? But people can remember what they were doing 2 years ago. And so
unless
they
there
can
was
think
something,
about, this is,
maybe they changed the job and stuff like that. If you can, anchor it on an event, maybe,
You can, there are lots of things. People change jobs, but if you're a software engineer, right, you know what you were doing 2 or 3 years ago. You can think about the changes that have happened since then, right? Like I need to get up to speed on all these AI technologies nowadays, right? So many great trends.
Yeah. So those 3 questions, but for a marketer, and I think you mentioned it somewhere in one of those interviews or the book, one additional question would be around like how do you like the discovery loop, like right, like how do you stay up to date with what's happening, how do you who do you follow, how do you learn new things, like follow-ups there, right?
Yes.
That'll be
Yeah, every developer has a technology discovery loop, right? And this is different from business executives, which is why like the lead funnel doesn't work for developers. Okay, and that blows people's minds because they want to think their developer business is like a B2B business, but it's not. Okay, every developer has a way of learning about new technology, and I call this the technology discovery loop. And these are the same things you do every day, every week, every year, the meetups you go to, the conferences you go to, the blogs you read, right? To keep abreast of what's going on in your area of interest. Okay, this is not true in other areas of the economy, but it absolutely is true for developers. And so this is a great gift to developer marketers. You don't need to invent a new mechanism of getting your story in front of developers. Developers have mechanisms. You need to figure out for the group of developers you're targeting, what is their mechanism? And how do I get my story included among the things they read, right? How can I find the influencers that are important to them, right? And, get on the same platform or get that influencer to repeat parts of my story. Right?
Adam, I have a question.
I
have a question around that because, like, I think, I really, that's something that I keep coming back to and thinking about it. There's this concept of dark matter developers. Like you have in the university of dark matter in dev world apparently as well. Estimated, I think that around 70% of folks they're not really on Twitter. They are not on LinkedIn. They don't go to conferences. Like I remember interviewing someone and I did that through like paid interviews or something like that. But and it was like not like nothing, it seemed, and I wonder like that was like a more, sort of like a senior dev, family, working at a big like German enterprise, I think it was, and I was thinking like, so what do you do with those devs? And then I saw an article saying, claiming that there's maybe even as high, the percentage as high as like 70% of devs are in that bucket of folks who are not really anywhere. So what do you do with them? How do you approach that?
Okay, most people are not early adopters. That's okay. They're doing their jobs. Okay, but if you are at a startup, they are not going to adopt your technology. Let them go. Don't waste time trying to read them. And the answer is, a lot of these people, even if they are an early adopter, they're just crazy busy. But in every organization, there are alpha developers, right? Who, in the way that they bring extra value to their organization is they're always out searching for what's new, right? Yep. Every organization has some intractable problems. And if an alpha developer can find something new, a new way of attacking that problem, that's how they get recognition. So you need to think with this alpha developer in mind, right? This is the person that you want to touch, because even the people that don't read blogs and don't go to conferences, they have colleagues.
Go to work. Yeah, exactly.
They go to work. They have colleagues. They have this problem they've been grappling with, and a colleague might say, I've heard about this. This might be the answer to our problem. Now, here's the key with alpha developers. This is why free product is so important. Alpha developers have no budget. They're developers, right? All they have is curiosity, which is so important. Okay, so as a vendor, you need to be able to satisfy their curiosity and not ask them to buy anything, because they can't. That's how to get the alpha developers on your side. right? Give them free product that actually solves a problem, and they will become enthusiastic. And when I say free product, I don't mean free trial. Free trial is not free product, okay? Because the one thing an alpha developer, the one thing an alpha developer will never do is collude with a salesperson. And a free trial is just a way to entice you to end up talking to a salesperson. So they'll avoid free trial software. But software that's really free, especially free and anonymous, fantastic. They will use it. If it works, they'll recommend it.
Yeah.
Right. So there are so many different levels of free. I recommend you have a free and anonymous product to establish that you're providing value. And then you need to sell people to upgrade to a free account. Because a free account, you store state and you can figure out who people are, right, with their email address or something.
Yeah, so that is something I was wondering when reading your book. Do you treat the free product that I can sign up on a burner email as free, or as free anonymous, or not really?
No. If you need an email to sign up for it, okay, it's not free and anonymous, right? Even if it's a burner email, just have a product that's completely free. Right, not pretend anonymous, really anonymous. So anyone can use it.
How do you do that in POG? In many, like the vast majority of products.
You go to Sourcegraph, and this has a website that allows you to search open source code. You don't need to sign in.
So you mean like it could be like an interactive.
You could host it,
or
you could give it away. See, not a demo. Actually, provide a product that does something. That does something. No, you're thinking about the product. Think about the problem, right? Carve off a piece of the problem that is especially widespread and painful. Not everything your product does, but just a piece of the problem, and say, I'm going to deliver to the market a free, anonymous piece of software that solves this problem. And this is what I'm going to use to create reputation for my company.
Understood.
As we are contributing to the community, we are solving a problem.
So just to see if I understand what you said, because it seems that I had a different, understanding, right? So what you're saying is basically have that. It's not about letting people sign up on a Gmail. You should do that anyway, but it's not that. You should have. It's not about the interactive sandboxes or demos or example projects and stuff like that. It's valuable, but it's a different thing. You're talking about actual, free anonymous product that I can use to solve a small job to be done, perhaps, or a big one, but a part of the bigger, let's say, offering of the problem, solving product that you build that is completely free, completely like there's nothing, no gate, not gated at all, nothing that would stop anyone from using it. Is that
absolutely fair? Absolutely fair. Neo4j. Right, we had an open source community edition of the product, right? That we just let go for free, no registration required, and that free version became the dominant graph database out there. That's what everyone learned how to do graph databases on. Okay, and as a marketer, that created challenges, which was I have tens of thousands of users, and I don't know who any of them are.
Yeah.
Right. How in the world do I persuade them that some of them need to purchase an enterprise edition? That is a challenge, right? The way that we got over that challenge, right, was through writing the book, Graph Databases. Okay. Because we learned something interesting. People would not fill out a form to download software, right, with a $30,000 average sales price, right? They expected the product to be free and anonymous, and so we gave it to them free and anonymous. Okay, but then we published the book with O'Reilly, and we had a deal with O'Reilly. We gave away PDFs of the book to people who came to our website, and it turns out the same people that would not give us an email for a $30,000 piece of software would happily fill out 14 fields to get a free $30 O'Reilly book.
Yeah, there's this joke. I remember somebody, saying that the same story, but about a T-shirt. Like you're gonna have 1,500 ad blocks and use a burner email and everything. But for the T-shirt, yeah, it's fine. Let me.
Oh my God!
Let me give you my social security
we gave
number.
away so many T-shirts. The JFrog T-shirt, is an icon. Right. And as a matter of fact, we had a brilliant artist design new T-shirts for us every year. And then every January we made unveiling the next year's T-shirt an event. And we had our committed fan base who would, collect new T-shirts every year, and they'd wear the old one to meetups and our conferences, right? And it became a thing. Doing a conference with JFrog meant that we're not talking about the product in the booth. We're just handing out T-shirts. Okay. And it was great because we'd hand out T-shirts. People would think well of us. And then later on, we'd have a conversation and it's like, hey, I'm wearing your T-shirt today.
Yeah.
So
those are fantastic. If you nail it. Like, I think it's another thing where, it's sort of through the T-shirt, you can show that you understand the problem space, you understand the problem, you can empathize. Like, it's sort of another way of showing that you're part of the tribe versus you're an outsider who's trying to, shift to something. So I think that's but I'm with you. But
my favorite JFrog T-shirt was we had a frog skeleton on the front, and we used that to launch the JFrog X-Ray product.
Oh, like that. I like that. That's cool. Also, like, I think there's something about those, what do you say, anthropomorphized, animals. I don't know if JFrog really did, but in that case, I think it sort of did. But like, that's one of the levers that is rarely used, but something extremely memorable. Something that really
devs love mascots.
Yeah,
I mean, it's just over and over again. Animals or plants, right? One of my early hit products was Rational Rose. And I remember people telling us, "Oh, devs aren't going to like flowers." Rose was hugely popular, right? We had people put rose tattoos on. Rational Rose, yes, my first hit product.
Nice.
And we got tattoos that people put on, rose tattoos.
No way. Wow. What is the product? What was that?
The product that was 30 years ago was one of the first object-oriented design tools. You could lay out software graphically, generate code, or you can analyze code and get a graphic. I mean, people still deal with the problem right now. It was one of the first products to support the UML, the Unified Modeling Language.
Nice. Cool. But maybe, stopping a bit, on the T-shirts and coming back, coming back to those questions and what do you extract from those? I think for me, something like, there are many things that you mentioned in different, places around the, the problem, the story, but something that I'm really interested about is you mentioned in the book that the best marketing ideas come from developers, come from your audience,
so true.
right? And I don't think on the podcast I listened to it, and in the book you really, had a chance to go deeper into this. And I really want to understand maybe, some examples, or what are some probing questions that you like to ask, to like go deeper into uncovering what could be, what could be done, what could be better ways to, to solving something for developers. Maybe those are the free, anonymized products, ideas, or something. I don't know. Like, I'm really fishing for, examples of ideas that came from those tabs for acquiring new
you know what?
devs.
You're going to be shocked by my answer to you here. Okay. Which is, don't ask those questions. Okay. What you really want is you want to ask open-ended questions and then just let your tab members talk. Yeah. Okay. Really 30 minutes, right? 5 questions. You're going to be talking for less than 2 minutes of that 30. Okay. Yeah. You want to get your tab member to talk, and the ideas will just pour out of them. You're not an interrogator, right? Yeah. You don't need to pry them out. So this is not going to be always true. A lot of people will give you short answers and that's done. But what I have found is the most committed people, they've been waiting for they have been thinking about this problem forever, for years, okay? They think about it every night at 2 a.m., okay? And no one is interested in talking to them. Their partner is not interested. Their kids are not interested. Their boss is not interested. Finally, you show up and you're interested in this problem that they've thought about for years, right? Whenever they wake up in the middle of the night, they won't shut up, right? They're so happy that someone's listening to you. And your job is to listen, right? Go through, record everything related to this problem area that they're telling you, right? This is the most valuable information you will ever get. But you can't rely on one person to do this. You need to do this for a wide variety of people.
So let's say you do that.
That's my experience.
Let's say you do that, right? And I've done flavors of this, many times. I think I'm with you on the side of, like, yeah, like understand the problem, understand the workflow. What do you do before? What do you do after, you know, a certain activity?
Even that's too detailed. Understand what causes the problem.
And what do you do with like?
Why is the problem important? Okay, then when I do an analysis, right? What the framework that I teach is I teach the pains, gains, jobs to be done framework, and there is an absolutely wonderful book.
Christensen?
Here, I'll pitch someone else's book here. Value Proposition Design. Okay, Alexander Osterwalder. Okay,
I didn't read that one. I'm gonna put it on my list.
I love it. And if you can read the back cover, it's called Bad Value Proposition Design: How to Do It Wrong.
Cool. Yeah, so you're saying about the framework that you teach.
So the framework is pains, gains, jobs to be done, and then I add in changes to the environment. Right, those are the most important things that you look for when you're looking at the transcripts of your interviews. Okay, and then you need to go through this, you edit them, you analyze them, right, and you look for what are the common pains. Now, what's also interesting is as you do analysis of this, is that you can collapse the personas, right? If there are people that you think are different personas, but then you interview multiple people in each persona and they answer the questions in the same way, then from your perspective, it's the same persona. So it's not unusual for a startup to think they have 12 different personas they're interacting with, but by the end of the first month of tab calls, they realize there are only 3.
Yeah, they have 12 different
and everyone
titles.
falls in one of those categories.
12 different titles,
12 different
but
titles,
they do have 3.
Right, but they have, right, there are really 3 different perspectives on the problem, right? And by analyzing the pains, gains, and jobs that each of these personas identify, you can create, compelling value propositions for each one of them. Now, that's simply the first time through, right? That gives you enough material to create an analysis. Now you need to go back to the tab and do the second tab call. Okay, and the first tab call is about you're trying to extract what are the problems that people have, right? The second tab call is you're trying to get a sense of the priority. So on the second tab call, you tell people, look, I talked to a few dozen of your peers, asked them the same questions, right? Did an analysis, and here are the results. Now, everyone wants to hear this result, so this is this is how you get second tab.
By the way, you mentioned it I think in the book, and I think that's one of the good offers that people can do when they want to get people to do the tab, that you're going to share those results from the peers, or you have results from the peers. It's one of the offers that actually people care about, a lot.
Devs are intently curious about what their peers are up to, and there isn't a good mechanism of doing it. And as a vendor, you are in a privileged position to talk to lots of people in an industry, right? Yeah. Tell people what their peers are up to, right? And you come back and you say, for people in your position, right, it seems like these are the top 3 problems in the industry, right? Do you agree or do you disagree, and why or why not? Okay. And then you zoom in on them and say, would you agree that these are problems in your company? Okay, yeah, why or why not, right? And then zoom in. Are these your problems? Are you committed to solving this problem in the next 6 months? And if the answer is yes, are you committed to solving this problem in the next 6 weeks? Because you're qualifying people as you go, and you're trying to understand what type of person is, has a hair on fire problem. Obviously, that I've been through quite a few of them, right? What do they need to solve right now? Versus, yeah, it's a problem, but it's not one of my, top 3 problems, so I can live with it for a while longer, right? And this is crucially important, understanding priorities, because the number one killer of startups is you're solving a problem that is not a top 3 problem for anyone in particular. Even though it would be good for the organization.
So true. This is so true. And I think because you end up being in that zone where it is important. Like people say, this is important. Great that you're doing it. There's a lot of enforcement, but then for some reason, it never gets into the budget discussions. It never gets into the top 3 things solved this quarter. And you're just like, oh man.
I've lived through this so many times, and there's nothing so frustrating because every call you have is a good one. People say, oh, we love the product. Yeah, we could see the value it would produce. And but it's simply not going to happen this year or next year or any year, right? So you need to understand the priority of the problem, right? And you come back and you say, okay, for this group of users, right, it's a top 3 problem. That's great. Or no one that you found is the top 3 problem, in which case you need to seriously rethink the problem that you're attacking, right? Maybe the problem that you're attacking, all it did was give you access to enough people to allow you to pivot and say, no, this is the real problem we're going to go after, because this is what people want to spend money on, right? You need to develop products people want.
Yes.
And people want to solve problems. That's so important.
That's the core. I think like nothing happens if you don't do that. So like I think a lot of those things that you mentioned here and in the book and the universe I've listened to, they speak to this, the most important part, which is if you're not solving the important problem, you're going to be in trouble. You understand what are those problems, how, what are top priorities, what are the gains that people get when they solve it, what are they afraid of, what is that big change, all of those different things, they sort of fall in the bucket of the core for me, product marketing and strategy work of understanding what to do. I'm wondering if there is and my initial question was around that, if those interviews, they also inform the tactical acquisition sort of side of things, like figuring out how to better attract people, and how do they inform that that side of the of the marketing department, or of the
you just simply you ask people what their technology discovery loop is. And here's an exercise that I'm going to tell you this thing, and it's going to seem so obvious, yet so few people do this. Okay, we've already talked about the fact that developers are highly influencer driven, right? Not Instagram models, but people like Kelsey Hightower, right? Everyone has a list of influencers they follow, right? In your segment, can you write down the names of the top 40 influencers, developer influencers, the people who've written books, right? Given conference talks, right? Have, great videos out there, right? Then spend an hour, right? And search on every one of these people and find out where do they post on social media. Because these people have already assembled the audience.
There are products for that.
All have publications.
There are products for that.
Yeah,
Like
great products.
Plug.dev is is one I know.
Yes.
But there are others it's like I'm with you. Like it's a funny thing with like developers would never say they care about influencers, but they do. So much is crazy.
Yes. Right. As I said earlier, the most social profession there is, right? So figure out who are the influencers that already exist, right? And maybe you're inventing a new category, but they're in adjacent categories. Okay. Where is their audience, right? They've already assembled the audience for you, right? Now you need to put yourself on stage.
So let's go level deeper here. So let's go level deeper here. So let's say, we figured out those places. We asked that question, where do you hang out online, or how do you stay updated, however you want to phrase it. Ask some follow-ups. People said maybe newsletters, which ones, YouTube, which people, which channels, whatever that is, right? We have that list. And starting with the influencers, as I think this is like still a very important place to talk about. Will be for a long time probably. What do you do? Like, one thing you can try and establish a relationship with them, do partnerships, stuff like that.
Okay.
How do you approach it?
Don't do this. I'd love it if that worked, but in my experience, it does not work. Okay. Influencers can make a lot of money from it, but the vendors rarely see a positive outcome, right? And if I'm annoying someone, I'm sorry, but this is my experience. Right? Here's the real goal. The real goal is not you're going to pay some influencer and generate leads. That's not going to happen. Okay. Your goal is to become the developer influencer, right, around your product. Become the trusted expert. Okay. And how do you do that? Right? The first step is, you need to get an opinion, a point of view out on social media, right? Then you need to talk to other people. You create a podcast, or you do tab interviews and write them up, right? And establish that that you are, a journalist reporting on this area, right? But the way that you are seen as an expert is when other experts cite you and repost you and retweet you. Okay.
That's ideal.
And so
but that's ideal, right? Like that. Yeah. We're talking about that ideal setup.
That's the ideal setup. And that's what you need to be striving for. You need to be producing content, a podcast, interview, YouTube, whatever, okay, that's interesting enough so that when you do interact with an established developer influencer, okay, you're working with them not as a client, but as a peer. And if you try and accelerate the process by saying, oh no, we're just going to pay them, right? It's not going to work.
I mean, I think
you need to bring an expert
let's talk
point
on
of
this
view.
one. I think because I think there's this concept of first paying, then building the organic side of it, right? Where whether that be Google or that be running ads in different places, right? And then actually creating this yourself. I think what you're talking about, like creating something where you're a peer to that influencer and you develop that point of view, we're talking years, sometimes, right? This is a long process. In the meantime, I'm gonna get fired. I'm gonna get fired 3 times, and so, like, as a marketer, obviously as a founder, by the way, I think and this is your focus, right? The founder persona, like the founder of DevTool startup. Whatever you say, I'm almost never, I want to have a follow up on some things, but like almost never I challenge, the advice for the founder. I think 100%, like if you as a founder, if you don't do that, then, it's going to be hard for you to really understand what you're building, et cetera, et cetera. And there's like so many follow-ups to it. But as a marketer, working at a startup and trying to do the best I can, to get my product in front of the audience, I will do some stuff like, doing the influencer deals. And yes, some of them are horrible. Some approaches there of like, just doing, hey, create a video of saying my product is the best. This is horrible. This doesn't work. Tweaks I saw that did work or that do work. And there's a great article by folks from Clerk and Hypergrowth Partners on that. You create those sort of like, how to build an application, and then only a small piece of that is the product that actually sponsors the video. So you actually, position it in a different way, so you can get value from it.
As a non-founder marketer, you have a different problem. You don't have the time that founders have. You don't have their reputation. You do have budget.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
That founders often, the marketing budget at early stage startups is 0 and it's going to stay 0, and you still need to produce leads, right? That's a different type of problem.
Yeah.
Okay. But yeah, the type of content that is effective for developer marketing, it changes by segment. Now, what's interesting is when you have fast adoption technologies, and I'm thinking about, in the past, Kubernetes, and today, large language models, what happens is counterintuitive, which is the level of expertise quickly drops. Okay, when a couple of years ago, the only people dealing with LLMs were PhDs, and as they exploded in popularity, all of a sudden, people with no background said, "I need to learn this," right? Mm-hmm. And so the average experience level drops from PhDs to mid-senior to entry level.
That is so true. That is so true.
That it's true. And then the other thing going on, right, is that the existing vendors, right, who are all PhDs selling to all PhDs, right, they have no idea how to create content for novices. Mm-hmm. And so if you're a startup and you can get out there with great novice level content, right, to someone, I mean, there might be, for all I know, LLM 101s, right? Here, if you're an experienced developer but no background in AI, how in the world do you get started on it? Well, actually, I've seen some people promoting that. So that idea is well taken, right? But for every specific area, can you be the vendor that has the best introductory content? Because if you can put that out there, and especially put that out there for free, right, you will gain in reputation, and people will come back to you for more advanced content. And if you talk about the problems, right, people will assume you've got solutions to the problems. Don't turn your videos into product demos, though, right? You can have product demos, but that's not educating people about the problem, and they'll just get irritated.
Just to build on what you said, I think is like that there's this common misconception here where, people say, yeah, let's create introductory. So we're creating for a person who's just learning programming. That's completely untrue.
No. Not that person. Okay.
Exactly.
You think about the persona, and you want a professional developer, but who's never done AI work. Right?
Exactly.
If I'm an expert in building B2B SaaS applications on Postgres, but now, AI is coming, what do I need to know?
Yeah. And I think that's something that, that people, think introductory, so they think it's like it's for the junior person. Well, in some sense, every developer is super senior, and every senior developer is junior at many, many different things. And
the technology is changing so fast that even your expert level people consistently find topics that they need to get up to speed with from square zero.
100%.
Right. And 100%. They look for an expert to guide them. And the expert is someone who's, maybe they've done the same journey 6 months earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I wonder on that front of, like, you mentioned, like, and now it was like very interesting, idea and a tactical thing of, introductory content created for a senior person who is just learning a particular thing that is important and the problem you're solving. I'm wondering, as that marketer with a budget, right, what are some things that you saw, work from your perspective, from your career, like day one, you weren't a founder at every company you worked at, right? So day one you come in and there's a budget that you can use. How did you approach that, sort of managing, building for long term with that, topical authority and understanding, and building yourself or folks within the company?
Yeah. So I'll talk about, this is something I've done not as a founder, but as a, as a VP of marketing at a more established company.
Yep.
One of the things I've done is I worked closely with the engineering and technical support teams. Okay. And this is, you got to get the VPs to buy into this, but we developed what exactly does it mean to be a senior engineer as opposed to an engineer? And this was true for both product engineers and for customer support engineers. Okay. An engineer builds product, right? Supports customers. A senior engineer, in addition to doing that, also does research. Okay. And then you think, what does that mean? Does research? Well, research is not complicated. There are only two parts to doing research, right? Number one, you have an original idea. Number two, you publish. That's it. Okay. And so we set the standard. What does that mean, to have an original idea and to publish it? Well, we canvassed our senior engineers and we said, our expectation of a senior engineer is that you will prepare a presentation about some topic that to be interesting to our customers, like once a year, right? And you'll do a webinar on it, right? Or write a paper or a series of blog posts on it, right? That's what it means to publish in our industry. And if I could get, I thought if I could get 12 people, that's once a month. That's actually a ton of content. Okay. Well, what turned out was the existing senior engineers in our organization, right? They felt this was just one more thing to do and their time was already precious. So some of them were enthusiastic about this because they wanted to, establish a name for themselves. Most of them weren't. But what turned out was all of the junior engineers who wanted a promotion to senior engineers, they became the most enthusiastic. Okay. And they realized, okay, here, this is the first time someone has explained to me a path for how to become a senior engineer. I'm going to do my job. But in addition, here's an interesting aspect of what I'm working on. I'm going to prepare a presentation on it. And if it's interesting to me, it's probably interesting to some of your customers, right? And so I was able to turn tech support and product engineering into a content factory of interesting engineering-focused research that our customers absolutely loved. So that's how to, build this sort of research-based culture into an existing organization. And the hard part, then the longest time, was getting the executive buy-in from the VP of engineering and the VP of customer engineering.
Any tips on,
but once they were in,
any tips on how you did that? Like, how did you roll it out? Maybe in a smaller way that showed value, or
prototype it. Find an enthusiastic customer. We had one particular customer support engineer who just loved this idea, right? He felt that he has been solving the same customer problem over and over and over again, right, for years. And he said, let me just put together, some training, right? And get that out there proactively rather than waiting for people to have the problem and call me. So he was enthusiastic about doing it. And then once other engineers saw the customer and user enthusiastic response to that, they said, I want some of that, right? And once the executive team saw how enthusiastic the customers were about this as well, right, then they started supporting it.
I like it. And I think there are examples, like if you examples of companies doing it, like tweaks to it. I know Tailscale, they, typically starts with the top, folks from the top CTO liking, to share their thoughts, or one of the founders, and then, hiring engineers who also can write, who can share their ideas, or like have some folks like that on your team, or just talking about, like, sharing the retro notes or whatever that was, like interesting things from a day to day. Like there's so much content that is happening.
From my background, I think JFrog did a fantastic there. Not every engineer will want to do it, but you don't need every engineer to do it. You just need a group.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Cool. Any other tactical stuff that we could take to, dev marketers out there on the side of acquiring that brand awareness, within the dev community, coming from interviews or otherwise?
Here's the principle. Devs are always hungry for knowing how what their peers are up to and how their peers are solving problems, right? So your job is not to tell them how to solve the problem. Your job is to let their peers talk and give the peers a platform for them to learn how they're solving the problem. Because the first step is that devs will go there and say, all right, I'm watching my peers, or maybe people who are slightly more ahead of me on this journey, understanding how they did the problem. And then when they solve the problem, it's like, now I want to be a guest on that podcast, right? I want to get my story out there. I want to be interviewed. Okay. So it's a cycle that builds on itself. You have to make your engineers look good, though. That's the most important thing.
Yeah, I think, like you mentioned, that story of JFrog with maybe more junior engineers wanting to do that because the incentives were aligned. If you think through that incentive alignment lens, and like if you as a company, even as a marketer, can make the community look good, can make them look smart, make them connect to other peers, build relationships, maybe get a new job, through some connections that they found at your booth or whatever, or communicate pains that they have through memes you share or t-shirts you wear, or things like that. Like you do something for them, and then and then a lot of good things can follow from that. So I think that's
absolutely
thinking about those things matters. Okay, I think we've covered a ton of ground. I'm wondering if there is anything that you'd like to.
Good luck editing this.
Yes, I will. I will work on that. But I'm wondering, if there's anything that you'd like to leave our listeners with, anything that you'd like to share around your work, things that you're excited about.
So let me wrap up and talk a little bit about why I'm doing what I'm doing. Okay. In a broader sense, today we're in the age of software, right? There's the Iron Age and the Bronze Age and the Stone Age. This is the software age, okay? But when you think about it, software still sucks, right? Why are we in the software age and software is still so bad, right? It's not as if we don't have the smartest people in the world working on it. We do, demonstratively, right? So I came to the conclusion, it's because the tools are so bad, okay? And then the question is, why are the tools so bad? It's not like, the smartest people among the smartest people are working on better software tools. They are. Okay. The problem is not invention. There are lots of people inventing much better software every day. The problem is that those same people don't understand how to get widespread adoption of their ideas. So my personal mission is to teach software tool founders how to get faster, more widespread adoption of their ideas. Because if that happens, if I can make 1,000 dev tool startups successful, then the tools will get better for everyone, right? And software will get better for everyone. That's why I do it.
Love that. And let's hope for so many of those founders that will create better tools to to go through some of the programs you're creating, some of the content that you're sharing with the community, and let's build that good software that finally doesn't suck.
Yes, exactly. Maybe in my lifetime.
Awesome.
Thank you, Jacob. This has been an awesome experience.
Thank you so much, Adam.
That's a wrap for this episode of Going Deeper into Dev Marketing by developer Mark Appare. If you like the show and would like to support, follow the show and drop us a review. It means a ton and helps other dev tool founders and marketers find us. For more dev marketing resources, check out markappare.dev, where you'll find tens of guides and hundreds of examples. For more visual version of this pod, go to our YouTube channel at dev_Mark Appare. See you next time.